It was a quiet, uneventful Tuesday morning when Michelle Carter decided to step into the bustling downtown branch of Sterling National Bank. The streets outside were alive with the hum of city life, cars honking, people chatting, and the occasional bark of a dog echoing through the air. Inside the bank, however, things felt calmer, almost too calm for someone like Michelle, who thrived on energy and action. She had stopped by to deposit a large check from one of her recent business deals. As the CEO of Humiliates Solutions, a multi-million-dollar tech company she had built from scratch, Michelle was no stranger to handling big transactions. But today, something about the atmosphere in the bank made her feel uneasy, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. Michelle was dressed impeccably as always. Her navy blue suit fit her perfectly, tailored to highlight her confidence and professionalism. A pair of gold earrings caught the light every time she moved, adding just the right touch of elegance to her appearance. She carried herself with poise, her heels clicking softly against the polished marble floor as she approached the teller counter. People around her couldn't help but notice her presence. She looked like someone important, someone who commanded respect. And yet, despite all this, there was a warmth to her that made her approachable. She smiled politely at the security guard near the entrance and exchanged a brief nod with another customer waiting in line. When it was finally her turn, Michelle stepped up to the counter where a young teller named Sarah was stationed. Sarah looked up briefly, her eyes scanning Michelle without much interest before returning to whatever she had been doing on her computer screen. It wasn't until Michelle cleared her throat gently that Sarah fully acknowledged her existence. "Can I help you?" Sarah asked, her tone polite but distant, almost robotic. There was no warmth in her voice, no genuine effort to connect with the person standing in front of her. For a moment, Michelle thought maybe the girl was simply having a bad day. After all, working in a bank could get monotonous, especially if you dealt with the same kinds of requests over and over again. But then something changed, or rather, Michelle noticed something change. As Sarah finally looked up and met Michelle's gaze, her expression shifted ever so slightly. Her lips pressed together, forming a thin line, and her eyebrows furrowed as though she were trying to solve a puzzle. It was subtle, but Michelle recognized it immediately. She had seen that look before, countless times in boardrooms, networking events, and even grocery stores. It was the kind of look that said, "I'm not sure what to make of you," or worse, "You don't belong here." Still, Michelle didn't let it bother her. She had learned long ago how to navigate these moments with grace and patience. Pulling out the sizable check from her leather wallet, she placed it neatly on the counter and slid it toward Sarah. "I'd like to deposit this, please," she said, her voice calm and steady. She watched as Sarah picked up the check, her fingers hesitating for a fraction of a second before turning it over to examine it more closely. The amount written on the check was substantial, enough to raise eyebrows, even in a place like Sterling National Bank. Sarah's reaction was immediate. Her eyes widened slightly, then narrowed as she glanced back at Michelle. For a brief moment, Michelle thought Sarah might simply process the transaction without issue. But instead, Sarah leaned forward, her posture stiffening as she spoke. "Are you sure this belongs to you?" she asked, her voice louder than necessary, drawing the attention of nearby customers. "This is a lot of money." The comment hit Michelle like a cold splash of water. She blinked, momentarily stunned by the audacity of the question. Of course, she had encountered skepticism before, especially in professional settings where people sometimes underestimated her capabilities because of her race or gender. But this was different. This wasn't just doubt, it was outright dismissal. Sarah's tone carried an undertone of accusation, as if Michelle were attempting to pull off some kind of scam. Before Michelle could respond, Sarah continued, her words cutting deeper with each syllable. "People don't just walk in here with checks like this unless unless someone else gave it to them." The implication was clear, and it stung. Several patrons turned their heads, some curious, others visibly uncomfortable. One elderly man sitting nearby raised his eyebrows in surprise, while a young mother holding her child's hand shot Michelle a sympathetic glance. Despite the rising tension, Michelle remained composed. She knew better than to react impulsively. Taking a deep breath, she locked eyes with Sarah and replied evenly, "I assure you this check is mine, please process it." Her voice was firm, leaving no room for argument, but Sarah wasn't ready to back down. Instead, she grew more defensive, insisting on unnecessary verification steps and making thinly veiled comments about how people often tried to pass off fraudulent documents. Each word felt like a jab, designed to undermine Michelle's credibility and make her doubt herself. As the minutes ticked by, Michelle found herself torn between frustration and disbelief. On one hand, she wanted to call out Sarah's behavior for what it was, blatant discrimination rooted in prejudice. On the other hand, she knew that escalating the situation would only waste more of her time and give Sarah the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. So she chose to stay silent, biding her time until the right opportunity presented itself. Little did she know, that opportunity would arrive sooner than expected, and it would change everything. As Michelle stood at the counter, her patience wearing thin but her composure intact, she couldn't help but notice the growing tension in the air. Sarah, the young teller, seemed determined to make this transaction as difficult as possible. Every question she asked was laced with suspicion. Every glance she gave carried an undertone of judgment. It was clear that Sarah wasn't just following protocol. She was deliberately trying to prove a point, though what that point was remained unspoken. "Do you have any identification?" Sarah asked abruptly, her voice louder than necessary. Michelle raised an eyebrow, surprised by the request. She had already provided her bank card and entered her PIN when she first approached the counter. Identification was typically required for withdrawals, not deposits, especially for someone whose account was already verified. Still, Michelle didn't argue. Reaching into her purse, she pulled out her driver's license and handed it over without a word. Sarah took the license and held it up, squinting as if she were inspecting it for counterfeit marks. She muttered under her breath, turning, the card over in her hands. Michelle watched silently, her jaw tightening ever so slightly. The delay was frustrating, yes, but it was the manner in which Sarah handled the situation that truly irked her. There was no professionalism here, no attempt to treat Michelle like a valued customer. Instead, Sarah's actions felt calculated, almost theatrical, as if she wanted everyone within earshot to see how thorough she was being, how careful she needed to be because of who was standing in front of her. The silence between them grew, heavier, broken only by the occasional rustle of papers or the distant hum of conversations from other parts of the bank. Michelle glanced around, noticing that several customers were now watching the interaction with varying degrees of interest. Some looked annoyed, perhaps sensing the unnecessary drama unfolding before them. Others appeared sympathetic, their eyes flickering between Michelle and Sarah, as if waiting for something to happen. One older gentleman sitting near the window shook his head slightly, muttering something under his breath that Michelle couldn't quite catch. Finally, Sarah placed the license down on the counter and leaned forward again. This time, her tone was even more pointed. "Are you sure this money is yours? Because we've had issues with fraud before and I'd hate for you to get into trouble." Her words landed like a slap, sharp and unexpected. Michelle blinked, momentarily stunned by the audacity of the accusation. Fraud? Trouble? The implications were staggering, and yet Sarah delivered them with such casual indifference, as if accusing someone of criminal activity was just another part of her job. For a brief moment, Michelle considered walking away. She could leave the check on the counter, turn around, and never look back. But deep down, she knew that wouldn't solve anything. Walking away would mean letting Sarah win, letting her behavior go unchecked. And Michelle had spent too many years fighting against stereotypes and biases to let this moment pass without addressing it. So instead of retreating, she squared her shoulders and met Sarah's gaze head-on. "I understand your concerns," Michelle began, her voice calm but firm. "But I can assure you this check is legitimate and it belongs to me. If you need further verification, I'm happy to provide it." Her words were measured, designed to diffuse the situation while asserting her authority. But Sarah didn't seem interested in de-escalation. Instead, she crossed her arms over her chest and tilted her head slightly, as if challenging Michelle to prove herself. Well, maybe you should explain where this money came from, Sarah said, her tone dripping with skepticism. Because most people don't just walk into a bank with checks like this unless they've been given it by someone else. The room fell silent. Even the background noise, the clatter of keyboards, the murmur of voices, seemed to fade away, leaving only the weight of Sarah's words hanging in the air. Michelle felt her heart quicken, not out of fear but out of anger. Anger at the assumption that she couldn't possibly have earned this money herself. Anger at the implication that she needed validation from someone like Sarah to prove her worth. And anger at the fact that, despite all her accomplishments, she still had to face moments like this. Before Michelle could respond, however, the atmosphere shifted once again. The glass doors at the far end of the lobby swung open, and a tall man in his 50s strode in, his presence commanding immediate attention. He wore a tailored suit and carried himself with the kind of confidence that only comes from years of leadership experience. His salt and pepper hair was neatly styled, and his polished shoes clicked softly against the marble floor as he moved through the room. This was Mr. Thompson, the regional director of Sterling National Bank, and he was making his weekly walkthrough of the branch. Michelle recognized him instantly. She had met him briefly at a networking event a few months earlier, and they had exchanged pleasantries about potential partnerships between Innovatech Solutions and the bank. At the time, Michelle had been impressed by his professionalism and willingness to listen. Now, seeing him walk into the lobby, she felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps this was the opening she needed to turn the situation around. Raising her hand, politely, Michelle called out, "Mr. Thompson, could I have a word?" Her voice carried across the room, drawing everyone's attention, including Sarah's. For the first time since the encounter began, Sarah's confident demeanor faltered. Her arms dropped to her sides, and her face flushed a deep shade of red. She glanced nervously at Michelle, then at Mr. Thompson, clearly realizing that this routine transaction had just taken a dramatic turn. Mr. Thompson paused mid-step, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on Michelle. A warm smile spread across his face as he recognized her. "Ms. Carter," he exclaimed, striding toward the counter with purpose. Extending his hand, he greeted her warmly. "What brings you in today?" Michelle returned the handshake firmly, her expression neutral but her mind racing. She gestured subtly toward Sarah, who was now standing stiffly behind the counter, her earlier bravado replaced by unmistakable unease. "Your employee seems to be having trouble processing my deposit," Michelle explained evenly, her tone betraying none of the frustration she felt. "Perhaps we can clear things up quickly." Mr. Thompson's smile faded slightly as he turned to Sarah, his gaze sharp and questioning. "Is there an issue here?" he asked, his voice polite but tinged with authority. Sarah stammered, stumbling over her words as she tried to explain the situation. I was just verifying the authenticity of the check, sir," she managed to say, her voice trembling. "It's a large amount, and I wanted to make sure everything was in order." Michelle didn't wait for Mr. Thompson to respond. With quiet authority, she added, "By the way, Mr. Thompson, I'm the CEO of Innovatech Solutions. We've been discussing partnering with your bank for our corporate accounts. Perhaps now isn't the best time to finalize those plans." The impact of her statement was immediate. Sarah froze, her face turning pale as the gravity of the situation sank in. Even Mr. Thompson seemed momentarily taken aback, though he quickly recovered, his expression shifting to one of concern and urgency. "I see," he said carefully, casting a sharp glance at Sarah before turning back to Michelle. "Ms. Carter, please allow me to personally assist you with your transaction, and rest assured we will address this matter thoroughly." As Michelle nodded graciously, Sarah quietly slipped away from the counter, her earlier confidence shattered. The room remained eerily quiet for a few moments, the weight of what had just transpired settling over everyone present. Whispers began to ripple through the lobby as other customers pieced together what had happened. Some shot sympathetic looks at Michelle, while others glared disapprovingly at Sarah. For Michelle, the relief was palpable. She hadn't come to the bank expecting to confront prejudice, but she also hadn't expected to let it slide. By bringing Mr. Thompson into the conversation, she had not only ensured that her transaction would be processed smoothly, but also sent a powerful message, one that wouldn't soon be forgotten by anyone in that room. The moment Mr. Thompson stepped in, the dynamics of the entire situation shifted dramatically. The air, which had been thick with tension just moments earlier, now carried a sense of anticipation, almost as if everyone in the bank was holding their breath, waiting to see how this unexpected turn of events would unfold. Michelle stood calmly at the counter, her posture relaxed, but her eyes sharp and focused. She knew that she had seized control of the narrative, and now it was time to let the pieces fall into place. Mr. Thompson, ever the seasoned professional, wasted no time in addressing the matter. His demeanor was calm yet authoritative, the kind that inspired both respect and compliance. Turning towards Sarah, who looked like she wanted nothing more than to disappear into the floor, he asked firmly, "Could you explain what's going on here?" His tone wasn't harsh, but there was an underlying edge to it, a clear indication that he expected answers, and quickly. Sarah hesitated, clearly caught off guard by the sudden escalation. Her earlier confidence had evaporated entirely, replaced by nervousness and embarrassment. Stammering, she tried to justify her actions. "Sir, I was just verifying the authenticity of the check," she said, her voice trembling. "It's a large amount, so I thought it was important to double-check everything." But even as she spoke, Sarah must have realized how flimsy her explanation sounded. After all, banks processed large transactions every day. It was part of their core business. And while caution was always encouraged, there was a difference between being diligent and being discriminatory. Mr. Thompson seemed to recognize this, too, because his expression hardened slightly as he glanced down at the check still sitting on the counter. "Ms. Carter is one of our valued customers," Mr. Thompson said evenly, his gaze shifting back to Michelle. "And given her standing, I would expect nothing less than exceptional service from our team." The emphasis on the word exceptional was subtle but unmistakable. It was a gentle rebuke, delivered with the precision of someone who understood the importance of maintaining professionalism even in difficult situations. Michelle nodded graciously, appreciating the gesture without letting her guard down completely. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson," she replied smoothly. "I appreciate your willingness to address this personally. As I mentioned, I'd be happy to provide any additional verification if needed, but I hope this won't affect future discussions about potential partnerships between Humiliates Solutions and Sterling National Bank." Her words hung in the air, each syllable deliberate and loaded with meaning. For anyone unfamiliar with the context, they might have sounded like a simple statement of fact. But for those who understood the implications, the significance of Humiliates Solutions as a rapidly growing tech company, and the value it could bring to the bank, they carried far greater weight. Michelle wasn't just depositing a check. She was reminding everyone present of the power she held as a business leader. Mr. Thompson didn't miss the subtlety either. His eyes widened slightly, and for a split second, he looked almost impressed. Then, recovering his composure, he turned to Sarah once again. "Please process Ms. Carter's transaction immediately," he instructed, his voice firm, "and ensure that all necessary protocols are followed promptly." Without another word, Sarah nodded weakly and began typing furiously on her keyboard, her movements hurried and clumsy. It was clear that she wanted this ordeal to end as quickly as possible. As the transaction was finally completed, Michelle took a step back from the counter, allowing herself a small, inward sigh of relief. While the confrontation hadn't escalated into outright hostility, it had still been draining, an emotional toll that came with navigating moments like these. Yet despite the frustration, Michelle couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. By staying composed and leveraging her position effectively, she had turned what could have been a humiliating experience into an opportunity for accountability. Meanwhile, the ripple effects of the incident were already beginning to spread throughout the bank. Other employees who had initially tried to stay out of the fray were now exchanging hushed whispers. Some shot furtive glances at Michelle, their expressions ranging from admiration to disbelief. A few even approached her discreetly, after Mr. Thompson excused himself to handle other matters, offering quiet apologies or words of support. One older woman, a customer waiting in line, leaned over and whispered,
You handled that beautifully. Don't let anyone make you doubt yourself. Michelle smiled faintly, touched by the kindness. These small gestures reminded her that not
Everyone shared Sarah's biases, and that there were allies willing to stand up against prejudice even if only in small ways. Still, she knew better than to let these moments soften her resolve. Change wouldn't come from isolated incidents alone. It required sustained effort and systemic reform. As Michelle prepared to leave the bank, Mr. Thompson reappeared, his expression serious but sincere. "Ms. Carter," he began, stepping closer to ensure their conversation remained private. "On behalf of Sterling National Bank, I want to offer my sincerest apologies for what transpired today. That kind of behavior is unacceptable, and we will take immediate steps to address it." Michelle listened carefully, her expression neutral. She appreciated the apology, but she also knew that words alone weren't enough. "Thank you for acknowledging the issue," she replied diplomatically. "However, I believe true accountability goes beyond apologies. If your institution is genuinely committed to fostering inclusivity, then meaningful action needs to follow." Mr. Thompson nodded, clearly taking her feedback to heart. "You're absolutely right," he admitted. "We'll be implementing mandatory diversity training for all staff members, starting next week. Additionally, I plan to review our policies to ensure that similar incidents don't occur in the future." He paused briefly, then added, "I also hope this doesn't deter you from considering us as a partner for Innovatech Solutions. We value relationships with forward-thinking companies like yours, and we're eager to demonstrate our commitment to excellence." Michelle considered his words for a moment before responding. "I'm glad to hear that you're taking steps to improve," she said finally. "But actions speak louder than words. If Sterling National Bank truly wants to earn my trust, and the trust of others like me, you'll need to show consistent progress over time." Her tone was polite but firm, leaving no room for ambiguity. Impressed by her poise and determination, Mr. Thompson extended his hand once again. "Understood," he said with a respectful nod. "We'll do everything in our power to meet your expectations. Thank you for giving us the chance to learn and grow from this experience." With that, Michelle shook his hand, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. While the encounter had been challenging, it had also reinforced her belief in the importance of using her platform to advocate for change. As she walked out of the bank, the morning sun casting golden light across the city streets, she allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Sometimes justice didn't come through confrontation. It came through transformation. And Michelle was determined to play her part in driving that transformation forward. Later that afternoon, Michelle received a phone call. The screen of her sleek smartphone lit up with an unfamiliar number, but something about the area code told her it was local. Curious, she answered. On the other end of the line was Mr. Thompson, his voice calm, yet tinged with urgency. "Ms. Carter, I hope I'm not disturbing you," he began, his tone polite and professional. "I wanted to personally follow up on what happened earlier today at the branch." Michelle leaned back in her leather office chair, her eyes drifting toward the panoramic window behind her desk. Outside, the city buzzed with life, cars weaving through streets, pedestrians rushing to their destinations. But inside her office, the atmosphere was quiet and contemplative. She had spent much of the day reflecting on the incident at the bank, replaying the details in her mind and considering how best to move forward. Hearing from Mr. Thompson now felt like both a relief and a challenge. "Thank you for reaching out," Michelle replied evenly, her voice steady. "I appreciate your concern and I'm glad we're addressing this directly." Her words were measured, designed to convey professionalism while leaving room for honest dialogue. She knew that conversations like these could either lead to meaningful change or devolve into empty promises, and she wasn't interested in the latter. Mr. Thompson cleared his throat softly before continuing. "First and foremost, please accept my sincerest apologies for what occurred today. It's unacceptable for any customer to be treated with anything less than respect and dignity, especially someone of your caliber. We take full responsibility for the behavior displayed by our employee, and rest assured, appropriate action will be taken." Michelle listened intently, her expression unreadable. While she appreciated the sentiment behind his apology, she also understood that apologies alone wouldn't prevent similar incidents in the future. What mattered most was accountability, and more importantly, systemic change. "I appreciate your apology, Mr. Thompson," she said after a pause. "But as I mentioned earlier, true accountability requires action. Words are important, but they need to be backed by tangible steps." Mr. Thompson nodded even though Michelle couldn't see him. "Absolutely," he agreed. "That's why I wanted to share some immediate measures we're implementing. First, the teller involved has been placed on suspension pending a thorough investigation. Second, we're rolling out mandatory diversity training sessions for all employees, starting next week. These sessions will focus not only on recognizing unconscious bias but also on fostering a culture of inclusivity and respect." Michelle raised an eyebrow slightly, impressed by the swiftness of his response. Still, she remained cautious. "Those are good first steps," she acknowledged. "But training alone won't solve the problem if the underlying issues aren't addressed. How do you plan to ensure that this isn't just a one-time effort?" It was a fair question, and Mr. Thompson seemed prepared for it. "We're establishing a diversity advisory board within the bank," he explained. "This board will include representatives from various communities, including leaders like yourself, who can provide guidance and hold us accountable. Additionally, we'll be conducting regular audits of our policies and practices to identify areas where we can improve. Transparency is key, and we want to make sure our customers know that we're committed to real change, not just lip service." Michelle felt a flicker of optimism. For years, she had worked tirelessly to break down barriers in her own industry, often facing resistance along the way. But moments like this reminded her that progress was possible, even if it required persistence and patience. "I'm encouraged by what you're saying," she admitted. "And I'd be willing to participate in the advisory board, provided there's a genuine commitment to making lasting improvements." Mr. Thompson sounded genuinely relieved, and perhaps even a little excited at her willingness to stay involved. "That would mean a great deal to us, Ms. Carter," he said earnestly. "Your perspective and leadership would be invaluable as we work to create a more inclusive environment. I'll have my team reach out to discuss the specifics soon." As the conversation drew to a close, Michelle found herself reflecting on the broader implications of what had transpired. The incident at the bank hadn't just affected her, it had rippled outward, touching everyone who witnessed it and sparking conversations about racial bias and systemic discrimination. By the time she hung up the phone, news of the confrontation had already begun circulating beyond the walls of Sterling National Bank. Local media outlets picked up snippets of the story, framing it as a cautionary tale about prejudice in corporate settings. Social media platforms buzzed with reactions, ranging from outrage over Sarah's behavior to admiration for Michelle's poise and determination. For many people, the story served as a wake-up call, a reminder that discrimination wasn't confined to history books or distant headlines. It happened every day, often in subtle and insidious ways. Some commentators praised Michelle for handling the situation with grace and dignity, turning a personal affront into a teachable moment for an entire institution. Others criticized the bank for allowing such biases to persist unchecked, calling for greater transparency and accountability across industries. Amidst the public discourse, Michelle chose to remain focused on the bigger picture. She knew that individual actions mattered, but systemic change required collective effort. That evening, as she sat at her dining table reviewing documents for an upcoming meeting, she couldn't help but think about the young teller, Sarah. Despite everything that had happened, Michelle didn't harbor ill will toward her. Instead, she saw the incident as an opportunity for Sarah to learn, grow, and perhaps even become an advocate for change herself. The following day, Michelle attended a luncheon hosted by a local nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting diversity and inclusion in the workplace. As she mingled with fellow attendees sharing stories and insights, she realized how interconnected these issues truly were. Discrimination wasn't just a problem for banks or tech companies. It was a societal challenge that demanded collaboration and courage. And while the road ahead wouldn't be easy, Michelle felt more determined than ever to play her part. By the end of the week, reports emerged that Sarah had enrolled in workshops focused on cultural competency and unconscious bias. According to sources within the bank, she had expressed remorse for her actions and vowed to approach her job with greater empathy and understanding moving forward. While rebuilding her career would undoubtedly take time, her willingness to confront her mistakes offered a glimmer of hope, a testament to the power of accountability and growth. For Michelle, the experience reinforced her belief in the importance of using her platform to drive meaningful change. Whether through partnerships, advocacy, or simply leading by example, she understood that every action mattered. As she stood outside the bank months later, watching its newly unveiled diversity mural shimmer in the sunlight, she allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Sometimes justice didn't come through confrontation, it came through transformation. And transformation, she knew, started with courage. In the weeks that followed the incident at Sterling National Bank, Michelle's life settled back into its usual rhythm, or so it seemed on the surface. She returned to her office, attended meetings, reviewed proposals, and strategized with her team at Humiliates Solutions. But beneath the calm exterior, she couldn't shake the lingering impact of what had happened. The confrontation at the bank wasn't just a personal affront. It was a reminder of the systemic challenges she faced daily as a Black woman in leadership. And while she had navigated those challenges with grace and resilience, the encounter left her more determined than ever to use her influence to create meaningful change. The public response to the incident only amplified this determination. Local newspapers published articles detailing the events at the bank, framing them as a cautionary tale about racial bias in professional settings. Social media platforms buzzed with reactions, some supportive, others critical, but all contributing to a broader conversation about discrimination and accountability. Michelle found herself at the center of this dialogue, not because she sought attention, but because her actions had sparked something bigger than herself. People were talking, questioning, and reflecting, and that, she realized, was where real progress began. One morning, as Michelle scrolled through her emails over a cup of coffee, she noticed an invitation to speak at a community forum hosted by a local advocacy group. The event was titled Breaking Barriers, Building Inclusive Workplaces, and the organizers hoped Michelle would share her story and insights. At first, she hesitated. Public speaking wasn't new to her. She had delivered keynote speeches at conferences around the world, but revisiting the details of the bank incident felt raw, almost intrusive. Yet, as she thought about the potential impact of sharing her experience, she decided to accept the invitation. If her story could inspire even one person to challenge prejudice or push for change, it would be worth it. The day of the forum arrived, and Michelle stepped onto the stage to a warm round of applause. Dressed in a striking red blazer that commanded attention, she greeted the audience with a confident smile. For the next 30 minutes, she spoke candidly about her journey, from the early days of building Humiliates Solutions to the challenges she encountered as a Black woman navigating predominantly white spaces. She didn't shy away from discussing the bank incident, describing it not as an isolated event but as part of a larger pattern of systemic bias. Her words resonated deeply with the audience, many of whom nodded in agreement or scribbled notes in their programs. When she finished speaking, the room erupted in applause, and several attendees approached her afterward to express their gratitude. One young woman, a recent college graduate aspiring to work in tech, shared how Michelle's story gave her hope. "I've been told I don't belong in this field so many times," the woman admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "But hearing you talk makes me believe I can overcome those obstacles too." Michelle smiled warmly, offering words of encouragement before moving on to greet others. Meanwhile, back at Sterling National Bank, the fallout from the incident continued to unfold. Sarah, the teller whose behavior had sparked the confrontation, remained on suspension during the investigation. While some colleagues expressed sympathy for her predicament, others viewed her actions as a reflection of deeper issues within the organization. Conversations about diversity and inclusion became frequent topics in staff meetings, with employees debating how best to foster a culture of respect and equity. For many, the incident served as a wake-up call, a stark reminder that biases, whether conscious or unconscious, could undermine trust and damage reputations. Sarah herself struggled to come to terms with the consequences of her actions. Stripped of her position and facing public scrutiny, she initially retreated into self-pity, blaming external factors for her behavior. But as time passed, she began to reflect more deeply on the incident and its implications. A mandatory diversity training session provided a turning point. During the workshop, facilitators encouraged participants to examine their own biases and consider how they might affect interactions with others. For Sarah, the exercises were uncomfortable but eye-opening. She realized that her assumptions about Michelle, that she couldn't possibly have earned such a large check herself, were rooted in stereotypes she hadn't even realized she held. Determined to learn from her mistakes, Sarah enrolled in additional workshops focused on cultural competency and empathy. She read books, watched documentaries, and engaged in conversations with colleagues from diverse backgrounds. Slowly but surely, she began to see the world, and her role in it, through a different lens. Though rebuilding her career would take time, she vowed never to let prejudice cloud her judgment again. In fact, she started volunteering with a mentorship program aimed at helping underrepresented youth pursue careers in finance, hoping to make amends for her past behavior. At the same time, Mr. Thompson worked tirelessly to implement the changes he had promised Michelle. Under his leadership, Sterling National Bank launched a comprehensive initiative to address systemic biases and promote inclusivity. The newly formed Diversity Advisory Board, which included Michelle as one of its key members, met regularly to review policies, provide feedback, and track progress. Training sessions became mandatory for all employees, from entry-level tellers to senior executives, emphasizing the importance of treating every customer with dignity and respect. To ensure transparency, the bank also introduced a reporting system that allowed customers and employees to flag discriminatory behavior anonymously. This move was met with widespread approval, particularly among advocacy groups that had long criticized financial institutions for failing to address bias effectively. Over time, these efforts began to yield results, not just in improved customer satisfaction scores, but also in a noticeable shift in workplace culture. Employees reported feeling more empowered to speak up when they witnessed unfair treatment, and customers praised the bank for taking concrete steps toward inclusivity. For Michelle, watching these changes unfold was both gratifying and humbling. She knew that transforming an institution as large and entrenched as a national bank wouldn't happen overnight, but she was encouraged by the progress being made. As part of the advisory board, she played an active role in shaping the bank's initiatives, offering constructive criticism when necessary, and celebrating milestones along the way. Her involvement also inspired other companies to follow suit, sparking a ripple effect across industries. Still, Michelle understood that true change required vigilance. She often reminded herself and others that dismantling systemic barriers was an ongoing process, one that demanded constant effort and collaboration. During a meeting with Mr. Thompson months after the incident, she emphasized this point. "We've made great strides," she said, leaning forward slightly in her chair. "But we can't afford to become complacent. Real transformation takes time, and it requires us to keep pushing forward even when the work feels difficult." Mr. Thompson nodded thoughtfully, clearly moved by her words. "You're absolutely right," he replied, "and I'm grateful to have someone like you guiding us through this journey. Your perspective has been invaluable, not just to me personally, but to the entire organization." As the meeting wrapped up, Michelle reflected on how far they had come since that tense morning at the bank. What had started as a humiliating encounter had evolved into a catalyst for growth, not just for Michelle, but for everyone involved. And while there was still much work to be done, she felt hopeful about the future. After all, change rarely happened in grand gestures. More often, it emerged from small, deliberate actions taken consistently over time. And Michelle was determined to keep leading the charge. Months after the incident at Sterling National Bank, Life had settled into a new rhythm for everyone involved, but it was a rhythm marked by change, growth, and reflection. For Michelle Carter, the experience had become more than just a personal story. It had evolved into a symbol of resilience and transformation. She often thought about how one seemingly ordinary day at the bank had sparked conversations far beyond what she could have imagined. It wasn't just her own journey that had shifted. It was the collective momentum of people coming together to confront bias, challenge stereotypes, and build bridges where walls once stood. The impact of the incident rippled outward in ways both visible and subtle. At Innovatech Solutions, Michelle noticed a renewed sense of purpose among her team members. Many of them had followed the news coverage surrounding the bank confrontation, and while some expressed anger or frustration on her behalf, others were inspired by the way she handled the situation with grace and determination. "You turned something negative into something positive," one of her senior managers remarked during a staff meeting. "It's a reminder that leadership isn't just about making decisions. It's about setting an example." Michelle took those words to heart. In the months that followed, she made a conscious effort to incorporate discussions about diversity and inclusion into company culture at Innovatech. She introduced workshops, invited guest speakers, and encouraged open dialogue among employees about their experiences navigating biases in and out of the workplace. These initiatives weren't just about addressing issues within the tech industry. They were about fostering empathy, understanding, and collaboration. Slowly but surely, the workplace transformed into a space where everyone felt seen, heard, and valued. At Sterling National Bank, the changes were equally profound. The newly implemented diversity training programs became a cornerstone of employee development, with sessions designed not only to educate, but also to inspire action. Employees who had initially resisted the idea of mandatory workshops began to embrace them, sharing stories of how the lessons they learned translated into real-world interactions. One teller, who had previously dismissed such efforts as unnecessary, admitted during a team meeting that she now approached every customer interaction with greater mindfulness. "I never realized how my assumptions could affect someone else's experience," she said candidly. "These trainings have changed the way I think and act." Sarah, the teller whose behavior had triggered the entire incident, continued to work on herself. After completing her suspension period and undergoing extensive retraining, she returned to the bank with a fresh perspective. Though some colleagues remained skeptical of her intentions, Sarah proved her commitment through consistent effort. She volunteered to lead peer mentoring groups focused on fostering inclusivity, using her own mistakes as teaching moments. "I don't want anyone else to feel the way I did, or worse, to make the same errors I made," she explained during one session. Her vulnerability resonated with others, creating opportunities for honest conversations about accountability and growth. For Mr. Thompson, the regional director, the experience served as a turning point in his career. He had always prided himself on being a fair and ethical leader, but the incident forced him to confront blind spots he hadn't even realized existed. Under his guidance, Sterling National Bank became a model for other financial institutions, seeking to address systemic biases. Articles highlighting the bank's efforts appeared in industry publications, praising its transparency and dedication to meaningful reform. When asked about the driving force behind these changes, Mr. Thompson didn't hesitate to credit Michelle. "Her courage and vision have been instrumental in guiding us forward," he told a reporter during an interview. "She reminded us that true leadership means listening, learning, and acting with integrity." As the months passed, Michelle found herself reflecting on the broader implications of what had transpired. The incident at the bank had ignited a fire, not just within her but within communities eager to tackle issues of discrimination and inequality. Local schools reached out to invite her to speak to students about perseverance and breaking barriers. Nonprofit organizations sought her advice on crafting campaigns to promote diversity in corporate settings. Even strangers stopped her on the street to thank her for standing up against prejudice. Each interaction reinforced her belief that individual actions, no matter how small, could spark waves of change. One particularly memorable moment came during a community event hosted by a grassroots organization dedicated to empowering women of color in business. As Michelle stood on stage addressing a packed auditorium, she noticed a young girl sitting in the front row, her eyes wide with admiration. After the speech, the girl approached Michelle shyly, clutching a notebook. "Can I take a picture with you?" she asked softly. "I want to be like you when I grow up." Michelle knelt down to meet the girl at eye level, smiling warmly. "You already have everything you need inside you," she said gently. "Just keep believing in yourself and don't let anyone tell you otherwise." The girl beamed, hugging Michelle tightly before running back to her seat. Watching her go, Michelle felt a surge of hope. Moments like these reminded her why the fight for equality mattered, not just for herself, but for future generations. Back at Sterling National Bank, the physical reminders of change were everywhere. A vibrant mural depicting diverse faces adorned the lobby walls, serving as a testament to the institution's renewed commitment to inclusivity. Quotes from influential leaders advocating for justice and equality were etched into plaques displayed throughout the building. And perhaps most importantly, customers reported feeling more respected and valued during their visits, a sign that the cultural shift was taking root. For Michelle, standing outside the bank one sunny afternoon, watching the mural shimmer in the sunlight brought a deep sense of satisfaction. She thought back to that tense morning months ago, the raised voices, the uncomfortable stares, the weight of judgment pressing down on her shoulders. At the time, she couldn't have predicted how things would unfold, but looking around now, she saw evidence of progress, not just in policies or programs, but in attitudes and relationships. Change, she realized, wasn't linear. It didn't happen overnight, nor did it come without setbacks. But it was possible and sustainable when fueled by courage, accountability, and collaboration. As she walked away from the bank that day, Michelle allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Sometimes justice didn't come through confrontation alone. It came through transformation. And transformation, she knew, started with the willingness to listen, learn, and grow. In the end, what began as a humiliating encounter became a catalyst for something much greater, a movement toward understanding, equity, and unity. Michelle understood that the work was far from over, but she also knew that every step forward mattered. With each stride, she carried the lessons of the past, the hopes of the present, and the dreams of the future. And that, she decided, was worth every challenge along the way.